Welcome back to the channel. I'm Big Chris. I've still got that big receding hairline, and in today's video we're going to be exploring the origins of the written language. Now, just a disclaimer before we start. Writing was being developed independently around the world's first ancient civilizations. So we see it in ancient China, we see it in the Indus Valley, the Greek Isles, we also see it way over in Mesoamerica. But what we do know is that the ancient Sumer, 6,000 years ago, was the location where a written language became widespread throughout the whole civilization. So without further ado, this is the history of the written language. So ancient Sumer was one of many ancient civilizations that formed the wider Mesopotamia area. And Sumer had a large population. We're talking about tens of thousands of people all living together. Now, just a reference of the time period, this is also what we would know as the early Bronze Age. So as people came together in large populations, we start to see things such as agriculture, irrigation and farming become bigger and more productive. So Sumer developed large temples throughout the city. And these temples were used for two purposes. The first one was to worship the ancient gods. But the second part was a little bit something you might not expect. They were actually used as large warehouses. Now, the reason for this was that as the produce, such as grain, was being harvested in the fields and brought back to the city, they could save some of this grain in these large temples. Now, the reason for this was that if Sumer was to ever go through a bad harvest or maybe a flood, it means that the city can still survive. It means its population can still use the storage within these temples to keep the population going, which ultimately means that Sumer can continue to prosper and get bigger and bigger even in the worst of times. So as goods were being moved in and out of these large temples, people were starting to record the stock levels on large clay tablets, and they were using pictures to represent stock. So as you can see on the screen, we have a picture of a piece of grain, and underneath it has little tally marks to tell us how many numbers of grain pots we have in storage. Now, as time goes on, these pictures become more simplistic. So on the screen, you can see two pictures of grain. The one nearest to me is more detailed, it was the original, and then the one just to the side is a more simplistic version. But here's the interesting part. The pictures not only show you what the object is, but what it sounds like. So just a quick example. The spoken language is far older than the written word. So by the time we get to ancient Sumer, everybody within their community would know what sound is. So they know that pig is different to horse, which is different to cow. And what the ancient Sumerians do is that they connect the spoken word with pictures. So the word and the picture become the same thing. Now, here's another interesting fact about Sumer. They used single nouns when talking to each other, which sounds a little bit bizarre in the modern age. So if you were to travel back to Sumer in a time machine and you were to listen to people talk to each other, what you would hear was the same words being said over and over. So pig, 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 cow, cow, cow. They didn't have joining words such as, the, and, to, be, and you. So they used lots of single noun words and they put them together if they wanted to create longer sentences. So you might have horse, stable, field, which means that they might want to take a horse, take it to the field, and then put it back in the stable. You might also hear something a little bit shorter, such as food, field, which could equally mean farming. So people start to become familiar with multiple words being put together to create longer words or longer sentences. Also, people start to learn what these multiple words sound like. So even the spoken word horse stable becomes as well known as the picture of a horse and a stable. Now here's a question. Why do we write from left to right? Well, the Sumerians started writing from top to bottom. And this is very similar to how we would write a list. But there's one big problem when writing in this way, and that problem is clay. So to write on clay, it has to be wet, and it's a really tricky surface to write on, because as you're writing, you can't rest the palm of your hand on the clay because it smudges the clay. So the idea of writing from top to bottom, although was what they knew, it was actually really difficult to do. So the scribes started to write from left to right. And as right-handed people will know, that makes it quite easy not to smudge the writing beforehand. Now, just to let you know, I'm left-handed. So these Sumerians, they weren't really thinking about me and maybe you when they were talking about left to right writing. I prefer right to left. Think that would have been better. But look, we can't criticise them after thousands of years. They obviously did a good job. But people were used to writing back then from top to bottom. And as you can imagine, when these scribes started doing left to right, that became a little bit confusing for people trying to read them. So what happens? They simply take the clay tablets and they rotate them 90 degrees. So now, instead of having left to right writing, it now looks up and down. Voila! Makes it easier for people to read. But there's another problem. Now, the pictures look completely different. They're rotated onto their side. And what we actually find is that this becomes the next stage of our written language story, because people, they start to recognize two types of picture. So we have the cow, which is upright, and we also have the cow, which is now rotated 90 degrees. And both cows become the same thing. Also, at this point, there are several neighbouring civilizations, one being the Akkadians, who decide to adopt the Sumer writing style for their own. And in fact, they add their own little bits to make it a little bit better. So determinatives were added wherever two pictures were too similar. So for example, if this cow and this cat looked too similar and people couldn't quite understand which was which, you would add certain marks to make sure that they were distinguishable and different. So there we are, everybody. That is the history of the written language. And I often do think, I wonder if the Sumerians, all them thousands of years ago, knew that this wonderful concept of the written language, I wonder if they knew it would still be in existence today, and not only in their language, but multiple languages all around the world. And in fact, as we were talking about earlier, how different civilizations were creating their own versions of the written language, I wonder if the Sumerians knew that their version, and the Chinese and the Indus Valley and all the civilizations, all of their written languages would merge together to create the written language that we have today. I think that when you start looking at it like that, it is fabulous, absolutely fantastic how we can read books and newspapers and religious texts, and we have that ability, and it comes from thousands of years ago. Wonderful stuff. So have an amazing day, everybody.